Dear friends, I just would like to greet you and welcome you to our seminar, which is dedicated to theological legacy of Jürgen Moltmann and its reception in current situation, specifically in the context of Russian aggression against Ukraine. This event is organized in cooperation of Eastern European Institute of Theology and Odessa Theological Seminary. And it's my honor now to introduce Alexander Hechenko, who is the president of Odessa Theological Seminary and who will be a moderator for this event. Welcome, Alexander. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Roman, and thank you, Ksenia. I really appreciate everything you have done to make this seminar possible. And it is a really great joy for all of us to be here and to listen to this important topic. As you heard already, we will be reflecting on the life and legacy of one of the greatest theologians of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century, Jürgen Moltmann. And we would like actually not only to listen about, but discuss the contribution and discuss how that may be related to our Ukrainian context and in what way we can actually develop some of the trajectories suggested by Jürgen Moltmann. And it is a great honor for me to present our main speaker today. And for some of you who are regularly part of our seminars, he's a familiar figure. This is Professor Paul Fiddes. Paul Fiddes is Professor of Systematic Theology in the University of Oxford. And he also director of the Project for the Study of Love in Religion and Research, supervisor in systematic theology, ecclesiology, and Baptist studies in the Regent's Park College. This is a Baptist institution which is part of the University of Oxford. Professor Fiddes is the person who actually can present about Jürgen Moltmann and his contribution, because he was part of Jürgen Moltmann's seminar after Professor Fiddes finished his doctoral studies, and he was part of the annual seminar under Jürgen Moltmann. I would like to mention a few books that Professor Fiddes has spent and which are related to the topics that were of particular interest to Jürgen Moltmann. First of all, it's Creative Suffering of God and Promise and Eschatology in Theology and Literature, and also the book on the Trinity, Participating in God, a Pastoral Doctrine of the Trinity. The most recent publications by Professor Fiddes are related to dialogue between theology and literature. And in those publications, Professor Fiddes considers such figures as Shakespeare, Iris Murdoch, Charles Williams, and C.S. Lewis. During one of our summer Institute of Theology, Professor Fiddes presented on theology of suffering and British poetry of the First World War. And today he will be speaking to us about Jürgen Moltmann, a leader for our time. Professor Fiddes, it's a great pleasure to have you, and the floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much for your welcome and invitation. It's really good to be with this theological community in cyberspace, and I hope to meet several of you more personally in the future. So it is always pleasurable to give a lecture about people one has known. I knew Jürgen Moltmann not only through his books, as many do, but through spending a postdoctoral year at the University of Tübingen, 1976 to 77, when I attended his seminars each week on Christology and the theme of believing and knowing. In years after that, I met him again at various conferences. He was truly a leader for Christians in our time, turning our eyes towards the possibilities of the future and to the vision of a new creation. He is still without doubt the most widely read German theologian outside Germany today, and for people of my own generation, he was the theological commentator on the events we've lived through over the last 80 years, from the Second World War to his death in 2024. His story as a theologian begins, in fact, just a little earlier than my own life memories in the mid-1940s. He himself tells us how he was first formed as a Christian thinker as a young man in the war years. One early event in July 1943 still stands out in his mind. He recalls how, still at school, his class was manning an anti-aircraft battery in his hometown of Hamburg during a firebomb attack by our Royal Air Force. His fellow school friends were killed, including the one standing right next to him, but he survived. He writes this: "In the night, for the first time, I cried out to God. My God, where are you? Was my question. During the next 3 years, as a prisoner of war, I looked for an answer. First in the Old Testament Psalms of Lamentation, and then in the Gospel of Mark. When I came to Jesus' dying cry, I knew, there is your divine brother and Redeemer, who understands you in your God-forsakenness." Moltmann had been intending to study physics and mathematics, but he turned to theology, especially, he says, as news of the atrocities of Auschwitz and the devastation of Hiroshima came through to him. During 1946 to 1948, he was a prisoner of war in a camp in England near Nottingham, a camp specially set aside for Protestant theologians. And there, captive German theologians taught captive students under the watchful eye of the British Army and the Young Men's Christian Association. There Moltmann began his theological studies, which he continued at Göttingen on his return to Germany. Moltmann records this: "The experiences of the life of a prisoner have left a lasting mark on me, the suffering and the hope that reinforce each other." The element of suffering is perhaps evident, but Moltmann also speaks of the need to have courage to hope in captivity. When the prisoner begins to hope, he writes, the chains begin to hurt, but the pain is better than resignation. Coming from a home where there was no belief in God, it was in the war that he discovered the reality of God as the power of hope and as a presence in suffering. I've begun where Moltmann began as a Christian thinker, because these two twin themes of suffering and hope run through all his work. They correspond to the cross and the resurrection of Jesus Christ, and the way that these two aspects relate to each other shaped his whole career as a theologian. I want briefly to trace this development of Moltmann's thought about the resurrection of the crucified one, and to see how it's been in practical conversation with the public and political issues of his time. Moltmann was doing theology in response to the reconstruction of post-war Germany and Europe. Through the period of liberation movements in the 60s and the 70s, to the ecological crisis of our present age. So first I want to consider hope that contradicts the present. That's the first section of my lecture, hope that contradicts the present. For a period following his theological studies and his doctoral work, Moltmann had no contact with the official Lutheran or Reformed Church in Germany. He was alienated by the way that the Protestant state churches had kept silent or rejoiced in the Hitler period. He was a member of several pietistic groups that were radical in the search for peace, based on Christ alone. Some of their slogans, he recalls, were "Fight Nuclear Death," "No Rearmament," and "No Contracts for Army Chaplains." By 1959, he was back in the mainstream Protestant church, but still deeply interested in a dialogue between Christianity and Marxism. While teaching in a theological seminary in 1960, he read with great excitement the book by Ernst Bloch, The Principle of Hope. He recalls that he read it in an East German edition while on holiday in Switzerland, and he says, was so fascinated, I ceased to see the beauty of the mountains. He wanted to do something similar in Christian theology, basing hope not on the Marxist analysis of history, but on the great biblical stories of Exodus and the resurrection of Jesus. Instead of Ernst Bloch's socialist dream of utopia, he wanted to turn people's attention to the Christian vision of new creation and resurrection from the dead. This was a period of hope in Europe, a moment of reawakening. There were many signs of hope: the Second Vatican Council in Rome, the civil rights movement in the USA, the movement for socialism with a human face in Czechoslovakia, called the Prague Spring, and in West German politics, the appeal from Chancellor Willy Brandt to dare more democracy. So Moltmann wrote his first substantial book that was to make him famous, Theology of Hope, in 1964. In this book, Moltmann claims that, I quote, "From first to last, and not just in the epilogue, Christianity is eschatology, is hope." Eschatology means, of course, a study of the last things, the eschata. It concerns Christian belief in the end of history, including such features as a final judgment, the renewing of creation, and resurrection from the dead. It's the resurrection of the crucified Jesus that is foremost in his book about hope. Moltmann understands the resurrection of Jesus by God as a word of promise spoken by God in the middle of history. In answer to his earlier question, "God, where are you?" the answer was, not in some mystical experience, but in a promise. As God was present among the ancient Hebrews in the promise of Exodus from slavery in Egypt, so God was present in the word of resurrection. While the resurrection of Jesus fulfills past promises of God, there is a surplus, an overplus of promise. The resurrection is itself promise of new creation to come. It anticipates the future. So this promise utterly contradicts the present, as the resurrection of Jesus contradicts the darkness of the cross of Jesus. It puts a challenge against the conditions of the present that we suffer in. This means for Moltmann that promise is not mere prediction. When we predict the future, we begin with the way that things are now and we just extend them by a statistical forecast or by a computer model. We prolong a line on a graph following the trends of the present. But promise creates hope in a totally new future, which can't be predicted but only dreamt about in great images and metaphors. Moltmann learnt that from Ernst Bloch. But he adds that this future is Advent. It is the coming of God. This is the new thing that disturbs the present. And it does disturb. Moltmann affirms that such a hope isn't escapism from the present. It doesn't put up with the oppression and injustice of the present for the sake of some future compensation in heaven. Hope in a new creation to come makes us discontent with the way things are now. It creates a kind of permanent revolution, breaking open the status quo, undermining the decaying structures of the present world. And so hope stimulates action in the present, which anticipates the coming kingdom of God. And the church can be a patch of liberated territory in the middle of the old world. These are some of the themes of hope that Moltmann explores, based on the resurrection of the crucified Jesus. Resurrection contradicts the cross, and this contradiction means transformation of the world in which crosses are set up. When the communist regime in East Germany finally crumbled in 1989, a review of this book was found in the archives of the secret police. The police report said this book was too revolutionary for East German Christians, and its ideas should not be spread among the churches. Moltmann was, the report said, worse than anyone. This dangerous book appeared at a time when hope was high in a new Europe, in a new world order. But 1968 brought a turning point in this mood of new awakening. Russian troops marched into Prague and put an end to the springtime in socialism. The movement of renewal in the Catholic Church after Vatican II seemed to have come to a halt. Some Catholic teachers of theology refused to conform and lost their jobs. On the 6th of April 1968, Martin Luther King was assassinated. The student leader, Rudi Dutschke, was shot at a demonstration in Berlin, and student protests became more bitter all over Europe, including in my own university and city of Oxford. Moltmann recalls that, he says, for me, the political dream of a united social democratic Europe collapsed. The end in Prague paralyzed me for weeks. Out of that paralysis came a new book, a different emphasis, The Crucified God in 1972. And this book presents us with suffering that is solidarity. That's the second section. Suffering that is solidarity. Moltmann turns from the resurrection of the crucified Christ to the crucifixion of the resurrected one. Partly responding to disappointments on the world scene, he also comes into dialogue with two other challenges to faith. The first is the question of how to do theology after Auschwitz. How can one speak of God in a world in which such horrific and unimaginable suffering happens? The second was called the so-called Death of God movement of the late 1960s, asserting that God was absent from the world. It seemed that if God had ever been present here, he was no longer part of people's consciousness and was irrelevant to the world as we now know it to be. To these challenges, Moltmann replied with the assertion that what is most true about God is revealed in the cross of Jesus. God is the God of the cross, or To be more precise, the cross is the event of the Trinity. The cross is an event in which a son suffers the loss of a father, crying, "My God, why have you forsaken me?" And so also the father suffers the loss of a son, and a spirit of surrender and hope unites them. This then is what the triune God is like. There is a deep separation and rupture in the heart of God, as a father rejects a son. But there is also a deep harmony as the self-giving of the Son is one with the giving of the Father. Both Father and Son suffer, says Moltmann, but in different ways. The Son suffers the pain of dying, and the Father suffers grief in the death of the Son. This Trinitarian shape of the cross overturns, in Moltmann's view, the metaphysical axiom of the impassibility of God. Moltmann isn't the first in our age to take issue with the long Christian tradition that God does not suffer in the divine nature. In fact, the suffering of God has been a theme in English theology for more than a century. But it wasn't such a common theme in German theology before Moltmann, and he's now made it a thought that cannot be escaped, even if some theologians in the scholastic tradition take issue with him. But why does God suffer? For Moltmann, the suffering God is present with human sufferers. In their suffering, they are not forsaken. And so this is a theodicy of consolation. He's grappling with the question, how can we do theology after Auschwitz? As he's also answering his own earlier question, God, where are you? The answer is that God is with the sufferers. Moltmann reminds us that, he writes, the Shema of Israel and the Lord's Prayer were prayed in Auschwitz. And he reflects that there would be no theology after Auschwitz if there had been no theology in Auschwitz. At this point in his book, Moltmann tells a moving story of a hanged boy in a Nazi concentration camp, which has been widely used since in Christian writing. The story goes that one day the SS guards hanged 2 Jewish men and a young boy in front of the whole camp. The men died quickly, but the child, being lighter, did not. The Jewish writer Elie Wiesel, who witnessed the scene and survived the camp, tells how, as the boy hung in agony, he heard a man asking, "Where is God now?" And he heard a voice within him answer, "Here he is, hanging on this gallows." Moltmann tells this story to underline the truth that God is present, suffering with us. Because God was identified with the suffering of the crucified Jesus, says Moltmann, he is also with all who suffer on the crosses of our world. In theodicy, wrestling with the problem of suffering, Moltmann comes into dialogue with Judaism and is especially influenced by the Jewish tradition of the Shekinah, the glory of God, which accompanies his people in a hidden way, wandering homeless in the world with them. At the same time, this theology of a suffering and crucified God begins to answer the challenge of all those who proclaim that God is dead in a kind of protest atheism. God is not dead, responds Moltmann, because God has suffered death. That is, God isn't irrelevant, not absent to a suffering world, because God is present in a hidden way in suffering. Moltmann wasn't the only one to give this answer in the 1970s. We might mention also Eberhard Jungel and Hans Urs von Balthasar. Indeed, Dietrich Bonhoeffer had already said this in the 1940s in insisting that God has allowed himself to be edged out of the world and onto a cross. And he writes, only a suffering God can help. But Moltmann had the popular touch in weaving together the concerns of theodicy, the challenge of a secular world, and not least the claims of the poor and oppressed. For this theology of a crucified and humble God leads us to dissolve our alliances with the rich and powerful and to make our solidarity with the humiliated and weak. In his book On the Resurrection, Moltmann had found God to be present in the world in the form of the word of promise. In this book on the cross, God is present in the mode of suffering. Both insights lead us to resist oppressors and the exploiters of our age in the name of the crucified one who is risen. Indeed, following the publication of this book, Moltmann had increasing contact with the theologians of liberation. Among the Catholics in Latin America, the black theologians of North America, the struggling church in North Korea. There's a symbol of this relationship in the tragic event of 16th November 1989, when 6 Jesuit priests and 2 women were brutally murdered in the University of San Salvador. This was an attack by government soldiers on Christian dissidents who were encouraging the poor to find a voice. Soaked in the blood of one of the priests was found a copy of The Crucified God, which had fallen from the bookshelves when he was killed. This book is now kept and displayed as a memorial to the martyrs. In the tension between cross and resurrection, we've already seen that Moltmann finds the Trinity disclosed, not as an esoteric mystery, but as a practical reality. The Trinity is the doctrinal form of the event of the cross. Moltmann now concentrates on working out what it means for the doctrine of the Trinity to be a liberating idea, and what it means for the triune God to be a liberating force in history. And this is focused in his books, The Church in the Power of the Spirit and The Trinity and the Kingdom of God. So the third section of my lecture is called The Trinity That is Liberating. In the event of the cross, Moltmann says, we find unveiled a trinity of suffering. A father who suffers the death of a son who suffers dying in the spirit of self-surrender. It's also a trinity of sending, of a father who sends a son, and of a son and a spirit who are sent. It is a sending which happens in history, in a specific time and place, but it has its origins deep in eternity, where a father is always sending forth a son and a spirit from his being. Eternal generation becomes mission in our world. This is the event of the cross, disclosing a trinity of sending and suffering. Yet the crucified Jesus is the risen Jesus, and so this is also a trinity of glorification. In the resurrection of Jesus from the dead, the Father is glorified, and this is promise of final glory for God. The Spirit who is sent out by the Father through the Son transforms and renews created beings. The Spirit creates anticipations of the final kingdom of God, wherever the sick are healed, the prisoners are freed, the oppressed are liberated, the marginalized are given a place and a welcome. And finally, they are to be brought to resurrection. as the Spirit carries creation back into the heart of God to give him honor and praise. This means that the Father will be glorified through and by the world. God has a future when the persons of the Trinity who've been separated by suffering and death will be finally unified in glory. The homeless God will have a homecoming. In one movement of the Trinity, the Father sends out, and in the counter movement, the Spirit returns to glorify. And so the tension of cross and resurrection is reflected in the history of the Trinity, in sending, suffering, and glorifying. This Trinity stands as judgment on all domination and oppression, because it's a fellowship of persons who make room within their own fellowship to include human persons. Oppression stems from the rule of one, the one monarch, the one emperor, the one dictator, the one political party, the one bishop, the one market, the one economic system. Moltmann traces this history of political and clerical monotheism and finds it to be broken open by the image of the Trinity. God is not a sole ruler, an absolute subject, but a communion of persons who mutually indwell each other and give and receive from each other. This image of the Trinity is to be reflected in the Church, Moltmann affirms. The Church has its place in the history of the Trinity, as it shares in the sending of the Son by the Father, continuing his messianic mission. As the Father has sent me, so I am sending you, says the Christ of the fourth Gospel. Christ, sent by the Father, showed an open hospitality and friendship to the poor and outcast, reflecting the openness of the Trinity. And so the Church is to be open, offering a friendship which isn't restricted to those who are naturally like each other. God opened God's self to what was totally unlike the divine being, to the finite, to death and nothingness. The Church is to be a fellowship of the unlike, of people who are quite different from each other in culture, race and status. These thoughts justify, I suggest, Moltmann's claim that the Trinity is a thoroughly practical doctrine, not a matter of remote speculation. But there's just the feeling that this is a more academic development without quite the passion of either theology of hope or the crucified God. The one was written in what seemed the springtime of the modern world. The other, says Moltmann, was written with my heart's blood. In fact, Moltmann himself tells of a key moment when he was sharing in a conference in Mexico City in 1977 with liberation theologians, black theologians, and feminist theologians. He suddenly thought, I don't belong anywhere since I'm not oppressed. I'm not black and not a woman. I can support these liberation movements and learn from them, but my existence is not in them. He realized that what he could do was to be a systematic theologian, serving his students in the University of Tübingen, helping them to understand the central truths of Christian doctrine in the context of our modern world. That's what I meant at the beginning when I suggested that Moltmann had been our most important theological commentator on the events of our last half-century. It isn't a criticism to say that he wasn't an activist. He wasn't in the situation to be that. He has enabled us all to think about God in the world in which we actually live. And his next book, God in Creation, 1985, took on the challenge of ecological disaster facing us all. Now, the fourth section of my lecture is Creation that is in God. Alongside the questions of theodicy and liberation, Moltmann was long preoccupied with the environmental crisis that faces humankind. It's in the face of this that we must think about such great Christian symbols as the cross, the resurrection, and the Trinity. Moltmann now takes up themes with which we've become familiar and links them to the wider vision of the whole of creation. The need to replace domination with community, for instance, applies not only to the human groupings of church and society, but to the world of nature. Human beings are part of a community they share with animals and all living things, and which is made in the image of the fellowship of the Trinity. Humans have become destroyers through dominating and exploiting the rest of nature. It is true, says Moltmann, that in the Genesis story, heaven and earth, light and darkness, the earth, plants and animals, all prepare for the emergence of human beings. They are the last to be created. But while other things prepare for them, humans are utterly dependent on the others. Without them, human beings cannot exist. Humans are the final creations, but not the crown of creation, as often said. The crown of creation, says Moltmann, is the Sabbath, the seventh day of creation, devoted to the worship and praise of God. If the organic community of the world mirrors the Trinity, then we can also find the tension between cross and resurrection in creation. There is a cross in the heart of God, a costly self-giving in the very act of creation, because creation from nothing requires divine self-limitation. Here Moltmann draws upon the medieval Jewish mystical idea of Zimzum, or the self-contraction of God to make room for creation and created beings. The idea goes that if God is to create from nothing, then there has to be a patch of nothing from which to create. But God is omnipresent, filling all things. There can be nothing outside God. So if God resolves to create, God must withdraw, leaving an empty space for created beings. Creation comes from a nothingness, an emptiness, which God himself yields up and makes way for. This, for Moltmann, anticipates the pain of the cross in several ways. It is an act of self-giving, making room for others. But also the nothingness which God enables can become something hostile and annihilating. It can become an aggressive non-being which is an enemy to being and life. It is this deadly nothing, Moltmann affirms, that God enters in the cross of Jesus and overcomes. He enters what has become a space of chaos and death and experiences forsakenness in order to be the God of the forsaken. Although Moltmann seems to take the picture of Zimzum rather literally, it can be, I suggest, an invaluable metaphor. It points to the self-limiting of God in creation, to give freedom for creatures to develop and mature. It provides what Moltmann calls an ecological space. At the same time, however, Moltmann speaks about the indwelling of creation in the triune God, a participation of all created beings in God's own fellowship of life. This doesn't confuse God with the world. We may say there is panentheism, everything in God, but not pantheism, everything as God. I suggest that these two pictures, a space outside God and a space inside God, are not fully reconciled in Moltmann's thinking, and I'm going to come back to this in a moment. A picture of dwelling in God alerts us to the second element of the tension between cross and resurrection. Creation glorifies God through the renewing work of the Spirit, and this praise of God is symbolized by the picture of the Sabbath day of creation. The Genesis account portrays God as working for 6 days and resting on the 7th. This isn't a mere rest, Moltmann insists, but a completion of creation, a festival in which God enjoys and blesses what he has made, and creation enjoys God. The Sabbath is an anticipation of the final day when everything will delight in God and there will be a feast without end. Mostly we experience time as linear, moving forwards from point to point within history. The Sabbath feasts give us a different kind of rhythm, a circular or cyclic movement of time, which alerts us, says Moltmann, to the overcoming of our present time in eternity. As Moltmann puts it, in the new creation there will be a new dance of life in the presence of God, in which through resurrection we shall participate, at least to some extent, in God's own eternity. This can be envisaged with the symbol of circularity, like a ring dance, as all times will now be simultaneous with each other. The celebration of Sabbath feasts also has an ecological benefit. We desist for periods from interfering with the environment, ceasing our work on it to give opportunity for nature to recover itself. And here Moltmann is thinking not just of the literal 1 day a week Sabbath, but building extended Sabbath periods of pause and rest into human progress. And so we move to the 5th section of my lecture, called The End That Is Justice. The picture of the Sabbath feast, an anticipation of eternity, brings us full circle back to Moltmann's original and groundbreaking theology of hope. On the eve of the new millennium, midway through the last decade of the 20th century, Moltmann published his book, The Coming of God on Christian Eschatology. And here Moltmann thinks in a more detailed way about the end of history, about the entrance upon a new creation which offers disturbing hope in the middle of history. As always, his writing is in response to the challenge of our age, and here we find both a dialogue with issues of justice and an engagement with the apocalyptic mood of our times. He observes that people speak today about events in an apocalyptic tone. The world seems to be hovering on the brink of disaster, of an end time, whether this is mass extermination through nuclear war, destruction of the earth through pollution, or the impoverishment of the third world through economic oppression. Moltmann, however, resists the temptation to call this an apocalypse, though the term is used in the media and popular journalism. It may be meltdown time, says Moltmann, but it should not be dignified with the religious term apocalypse. This would imply that God is responsible for human actions and the present crisis, or has designed them in some way in a master plan. And moreover, by bringing apocalypse into history, this takes away the true hope of future apocalypse from those who are resisting and suffering. Apocalypse means an unveiling or disclosure. It points to a moment of judgment when the truth will be exposed before the whole universe, when justice for victims will be made manifest. It points to the appearing of Christ and the coming of God. It is better, he says, to call the present crisis exterminism, because these are threats which can actually disguise the truth rather than reveal it. With the final advent of God, Moltmann affirms, nothing will be lost and all will be redeemed. Judgment, the bringing of truth to light, is the first stage in redemption. This is a matter of justice and human rights, because Moltmann is troubled by the vast number of victims that have been produced by the so-called progress of human life. Even in a healthy process of evolution, victims have fallen by the way, individuals, communities, species. If creation is to be completed, nothing must pass away, but all must be brought back in a new form. At the end, the raising of the dead means that everything must be transformed in the human world and the world of nature. So the day of the Lord will be a day of days. This day will be immediately present to all times in the history of the universe, because it will mark the movement from time into eternity. On this day, all will move from cross to resurrection, from Good Friday to Easter Monday. This is also the day on which God finally comes to dwell in his creation. The weekly Sabbath becomes an eternal festival. The wandering Shekinah of God comes home. Moltmann picks up again the idea of the Zimzum, the withdrawal of God, but reverses it. In creation, God restricts himself in making a space for created beings. In consummation, declares Moltmann, God de-restricts his presence, coming fully to occupy the created universe. At present, the world dwells in God, but God only dwells in the world in a temporary and fragmentary way, in the word of promise, in those who suffer, in the humble Shekinah. In the eschaton, there will be a fully mutual indwelling, God and the world in each other. In time and history, it often seems that God is absent. His face is hidden and turned away, but in eternity, God will be fully present. The coming of God will be making of justice for all creation. It's because Moltmann is so concerned for human rights that he advances a rather curious idea of a millennium. Before the final day of the resurrection of all and the entrance into eternity, there will be a period, symbolized by 1,000 years, in which the kingdom of God will come on earth. This is what Moltmann maintains. This will begin with the limited resurrection of those who belong to Christ and will end with the universal raising of the dead. Moltmann holds to this notion of a millennium, though it's advanced by virtually no other contemporary theologians, because he wants justice to be done for those whose rights have been trampled. There must be a period in which the oppressed on earth enjoy freedom on earth, in which the poor on earth enjoy a good standard of living on this earth, in which those who have been martyred on earth enjoy fullness of life on earth. There must, he thinks, also be a period in which the Jews receive the fulfillment of what's been promised to them by God. Justice must be done for them as well. This will be possible in 1,000-year reign of Christ on earth before the day of judgment. I wonder whether Moltmann has to have this millennium on earth because he's portrayed eternity as a kind of simultaneous time. In this rather static view of eternal life, there seems to be no opportunity for the development, growth and adventure of which people have been deprived in their lifetime. It seems that to give victims of suffering and oppression their justice, there has to be some other occasion than eternity, that is, a millennium. Moltmann, I think, is absolutely right that justice must be given to all created beings, but I suggest that it might be better to develop a more dynamic view of eternity in which there's some kind of time for real progression and development. Other questions could also be raised about Moltmann's thought. Indeed, he paints with such a broad brushstroke that he leaves himself open to criticism. For example, there is his social Trinitarianism. His view of divine persons existing in a fellowship or community in God sounds at times like three gods, especially when he describes them as centers of consciousness. And there's the danger of projecting our own views of an ideal human society onto God. In my own Trinitarian theology, I've focused on our participation in relationships in God, which are like a father sending out a son on mission, a son responding in obedience to a father, and a spirit opening up these relations to a new depth and a new future. This account relies somewhat on Moltmann's own language, but is used in a participatory way. If we focus on the relations, we can imagine them with a female as well as a male gender. Second, Moltmann's portrayal of a rejection or even casting out of the Son by the Father in the cross seems to introduce an unfortunate division into the Trinity, an actual imposing on the Son by the Father. Perhaps we should speak of Jesus suffering human alienation and estrangement that's the natural result of identification with sinful human persons, not something inflicted upon him by God the Father. So the Father is also deeply immersed into humanity and into death in the person of Jesus, but is not overcome by death. And third, when Moltmann understands God's limiting of God's self in creation as a kind of withdrawal or contraction of the divine being, this can sound as though God is being excluded from the world. Moltmann does, in fact, as we've seen, tend to present God as leaving only traces of God's self in the world at present, the Shekinah, the word of promise, with the intention of fully entering creation only at the eschaton. In my own thinking, I've suggested that God's self-limitation in creation is in a contracting to make a space within the interweaving triune relations of love, not outside them. So God's full presence is in the world here and now, though God can often be experienced as hidden. With regard to this last question, let me give you a personal reminiscence. I was once having a public conversation with Jürgen Moltmann at a conference, which, by the way, he'd most generously given his time to take part in. It was just a small group of Christian ministers, not a prestigious affair. Anyway, I asked him whether he thought that in his later work he'd come to say more about the presence of God and the kingdom here and now than he'd said earlier. He thought he had, and he said mischievously, "As I've grown older, I've come to love life more." This love of life springs from the resurrection of the crucified Jesus. In both sides of the tension, death and resurrection, Moltmann has deeply shaped Christian thought in our time. He has defended a view of future eschatology, giving people a real hope beyond the present. He's advocated the suffering of God, asking where God is in a world of pain. But let his last words be about resurrection after the cross, taken from the end of his book, About the End. He writes, "The feast of eternal joy is prepared by the fullness of God and the rejoicing of all created being. If creation is transfigured and glorified, as we have shown, then it is like a great song or a splendid poem or a wonderful dance for the communication of God's divine plenitude. The laughter of the universe is God's delight. It is the universal Easter laughter." Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Professor Fiddes, and thank you for this wonderful presentation. I think we already have several questions, but we'll stay till we'll hear two other presentations, and after that we'll have a conversation and discussion of the presentation. So I think that was the plan, right, Ksenia? Yeah, thank you very much. So it's my honor to present to you our next speaker, and this is Anatoliy Denysenko. Anatoly is the Senior Research Fellow in Eastern European Institute of Theology. He actually has written a number of articles, and in particular, in one of the issues of Theological Reflections journal, he penned the article in memoriam of Jürgen Moltmann, and you can find it on the website of our journal. Anatoliy Denysenko is also the author of a column on the Ukrainian Tyzhden website, where he writes about political theology, postmodernism, and contemporary culture and theology. And Anatoly will speak about Jürgen Moltmann and his assessment of some of the aspects of Jürgen Moltmann's thought. So it is my pleasure to invite you, Anatoly. The floor is yours.
Вітаю, колеги.
Good afternoon, dear colleagues. I'm going to speak Ukrainian. I'm grateful to interpreters and thank you to Professor Fiddes, to Alexander, to Ksenia, who contributed to this great lecture, this seminar. My lecture, or my response, is about Jürgen Moltmann's theology of the cross in the Ukrainian context. I will try to speak more slowly for the interpreters to feel more comfortable. There is this concept known as provocative anamnesis. This is the way of remembering the past, but not as the set of facts, but as a series of mistakes that have made us who we are today. According to this theory, we become subjects not through our successes or the correct or proper development, but through trauma and through missteps. And this term of provocative anamnesis, this is the hallmark of the German theologian Jürgen Moltmann, because he became who he was through the traumas of the war, the Second World War, that he endured. In the book, The Crucified God, I will focus on this book of 1972, Moltmann presents the doctrine about God from the point of view of the cross. He's trying to show that God is not indifferent, he is not distant from the rest of the world. The Christian God is the God of the suffering love, taking into account the difficult times in the context of the Russian-Ukrainian war. We pose a key question, and many people are posing that question, both believers and non-believers. Where is God, they say? Why is he not interfering into the current situation if he is omnipotent? Why is he allowing this bloodshed where the military and civilians, including children, are dying? And this has been raging for many years now. We could find the partial answers to the question where God used to be during Bucha disaster, or why he allowed the killings of the civilians in Mariupol. We can find the answers partially in the life drama of Moltmann and his books. Moltmann started shaping his ideas that he presented in the book back in 1955, when he was a 20 years old prisoner of war. In his book, he focuses his theology on the historical and specific place of the God's revelation on the cross of the Christ, in order to answer the question of where God is, but also to provide the answer to the discussion of the sense of evil and suffering. And in that discussion, they doubt the existence of the good and just God from the conventional theology. Moltmann is connecting his theology with the personal trauma that he endured back as a prisoner of war. He claims that it is impossible to understand theology without understanding the human condition that basically brought to this theology. The Crucified God book is part of Moltmann's personal struggle about God, his suffering under the hidden face of God, as he writes in his biography. There is this book, The God as the Mystery of the World, and there the question of God is not really like the classic metaphysical tradition where whether the God exists or what is God, but it is about where is God. The question that Moltmann is trying to pose, where is God? Theology of Moltmann is about his biography, the suffering and the trauma that his generation had to endure during the war and in the post-war Germany. They create the context where his theology of the cross came from. This is the attempt to grab the life in the turbulence of historical events and in the attempt to survive in the apocalyptic horizon of the world. For this vision, it was decisive to understand this lost young people and all of these atrocities of the mass killings and concentration, and the orgy of the death and the inhibition of life. But Moltmann also realized that, ironically enough, he is contradicting his own will, because he was part of the generation of the perpetrators. And also, it is related to the mass killing of the Jews. As a 17-year-old, he endured not only the suffering, but the massive annihilation during the fire in Hamburg in 1943. During that fire, almost 40,000 men and women and children were killed, and he hardly survived that hell. And this is the point where this dark night covered his heart and destroyed his spirit. It was an incredible experience of the total extermination or disappearance of people. Later, in the process, when Moltmann started learning more about the crucifixion of the Christ, he took the Golgotha as the darkness and the dark night of the soul of the Jesus Christ, along with his experience of the total annihilation or destruction. Where was God on that night before the crucifixion? Was he present in the hell of these Hamburg nights that Moltmann had to endure? Maybe God was far away. Where was God? This is the sad existential question that Moltmann is trying to pose, the question that brought him to the theology of Christ. This is the question of the classic theodicy that has never been interested in. Another experience that impacted his theology was his belonging to the generation of the Germans who lived at the same time with Auschwitz. He was not the one who was just staying at the historical faculty and looking back at that horrible crime of the Nazis, just reflecting back about it. He felt this burden of guilt in a different way than the Germans who were born later feel. In 1944, when Moltmann was on his way to the front as a soldier of the Hitler Youth, he met the eyes of the prisoners wearing the clothes of the concentration camps who were taken to the camps in the railway carriages. He's talking about this disaster, about this catastrophe that was named Auschwitz. Moltmann remembered throughout all of his life all of these weak and killed people in those camps. In the pictures that he was shown after he was taken captive, he was a prisoner of war in Belgium and in the UK in 1945 throughout to 1948. In 1961, Moltmann says, I walked through what was left of the Majdanek death camp near Lublin. I saw the children's shoes, the cut of hair, and I was overwhelmed by shame. And as I walked along through one of the camp's streets, I had a vision. I saw the mad children walking towards me in the fog. Since then, I have been convinced that there is a resurrection of the dead. Considering that experience, the question of the God became for Moltmann as the cry of these victims of the mass destruction. The key question raised in Moltmann's work is as follows. How can a person justify God in the light of Auschwitz? The conventional triangle that arises in connection with this question looks something like this. God is omnipotent, God is all good, and evil exists. But the problem is not that suffering or evil is present in the world, but that there is too much suffering or evil in this world. Usually, the conventional theodicy typically portrays God as a judge or an architect, standing above the process. But for an ordinary common person, in this scheme, God appears as a tyrant or a cold-hearted mathematician. In his works, Moltmann seeks to argue that we cannot rationally resolve the problem of evil. Where was God when a child was killed? Any answer that explains the death of a child is in essence abhorrent. In his book, Moltmann quotes a passage from the Elie Wiesel's book Night that Professor Fiddes mentioned. Moltmann does not justify suffering as the classical theodicy does, but he points to the crucified God who suffers on the cross alongside every tortured child. During the Russian-Ukrainian war, as of the early 2026, we have at least 766 children dying in Ukraine, being killed in Ukraine. Moltmann agrees with the justice of Ivan Karamazov's rebellion. I do not accept God, but this world, or I return my ticket to paradise. I have no need of such a paradise. But he also tries to avoid the nihilism that leads to tyranny. I mean, Moltmann. And if there is no God and there is no immortality, then everything is allowed and permitted. For Moltmann, Dostoevsky demonstrates radical honesty regarding the injustice of evil. Albert Camus represents the ethics of rebellion and solidarity with the oppressed. Elie Wiesel bears witness to God's presence at the very heart of hell. God on the cross is the only answer that can survive Camus' criticism and Wiesel's theme. Moltmann goes against classical theodicy. God does not justify suffering. He enters the suffering. God is on the side of the oppressed. God is not the source of violence. He is, in the same way, the victim of violence. In Moltmann's theology, classical theodicy is replaced by the dialectics of love. In philosophy, dialectic is a process where two opposing forces, thesis and antithesis, they come into conflict. We usually think of God as the very opposition of death or godlessness. But on the cross, God enters the very place where he shouldn't have been or shouldn't be, such as the state of being forsaken by God, like God-forsakenness. The epistemological principle of the theology of the cross can only be this dialectical principle. When he says, "Dear God, why have you abandoned? My God, why have you forsaken me?" This means that God experienced what it is like to be without God. Thus, God is even present in the God-forsakenness. This is the dialectical contradiction of love, the presence of the holy in the unholy. God's love is not merely kindness, where a benevolent, metaphysical, transcendent God does something good from far away. God's love is vulnerable. It embraces its opposite. To love those who suffer, God himself must suffer. To love the dying, God must know death. Therefore, in the context of Ukraine, it might be right to answer the question, where is God? He is with our soldiers in the trenches. He is with those who resist the enemy in the occupied territories. He is with those who endure pain, suffering, the destruction of their property, maiming, and the death of relatives in Kyiv, Kharkiv, Odessa, Sumy, and other places. A dialectical contradiction is the following: love and suffering meet on the cross. As a result, we have a new kind of solidarity. God suffers alongside those who are suffering. God absorbs the negative, suffering and death, into himself. He's overcoming them from within. But is there any such pain that will be beyond God? It's not an easy question to answer. One thing is clear: the Father and the Son went through separation. The abyss of human suffering lies within the life of God. Thus, the cross, according to Moltmann, does not resolve the problem of suffering as a mathematical problem. Instead, it is a symbol of solidarity. The cross of Christ carries a message: you're not alone in the darkness, for God was also in the darkness. And here I have my conclusion. The idea of the death of God, which defines contemporary philosophy and the contemporary experience of the 20th century, and I think also of the 21st century as well, This is the starting point for a conversation about God in the context of theology. The crucified God is just the other side of the theology of hope. Moltmann was caught up in the war when he turned 16. He was a good German, you know. When in July 1943, Hamburg was almost completely destroyed by the Royal Air Force bombers, Moltmann was serving in the Luftwaffe in the city center. Then at that time, a bomb fell nearby and killed his school friend. Professor Fiddes mentioned that episode today. Although formerly a believer at that time, he turned to God. And his question then was not, why does God allow this to happen? But he asked, my God, where are you? Why am I alive and the person nearby is killed? Considering the Russian-Ukrainian war and the number of deaths and mutilations and tragedy our society is enduring, we can find Moltmann's theology more relevant than before. He was not trying to escape the important questions or hiding behind the convenient images of God that we can often find in the church. In his book, he is trying to show the real interaction, the genuine interaction between God and humanity, the society. This book, The Crucified God, links the central Christian event, the crucifixion of Jesus, with the fundamental human experience of suffering. The war that has been raging in Ukraine since 2014, and that Ukraine is losing many people in this war, it cannot be forgotten. I was mentioning this dangerous memory that I mentioned at the beginning. It's not only about the crucified Jesus, it's about the crucified soldiers, warriors, men and women who were killed in the battles for Ukraine, who sacrificed their lives, and they shall be eternally rooted in the memory of the living. And the church's teaching must become a teaching on Christ's participation in the suffering and oppression of the Ukrainian people. It would be good if theologians, religious philosophers, and scholars of religion in Ukraine, for their part, were to reflect on the events of the last 10 plus years in the light of Christ's crucifixion. Thank you for attention.
Дякуємо, Анатолій.
Thank you very much, Anatoly. Thank you for this reflection. Thank you for trying to add some personal aspects related to our current context. Thank you for reminding us about the developments around. Thank you. I'm sure this is useful for our participants to be able to feel the reality that we are facing every day.
So now I switch to English, and we are coming to our final speaker today, and it is my joy and honor to present Taras Dyatlik. Taras is the Vice Rector for Development and Cooperation of Eastern European Institute of Theology, Ukrainian theologian, and involved in many theological projects and educational projects here in Ukraine and throughout all over Eastern Europe, in fact. And Taras will reflect on the centennial of Jürgen Moltmann's birthday, and his topic is a theological reflection amidst the 1520th day of Russian aggression against Ukraine. Taras, please, you're welcome. The floor is yours.
Yeah. Greetings to everybody. I hope you can hear me well. I want to share with you 3 ideas as my personal theological reflections after reading carefully several books by Moltmann. And first, some introductory words. Can the crucified God of Jürgen Moltmann still speak to a people being crucified in real time? And this is the question I bring to his centenary, and the question I cannot stop asking since February 22. And before I try to answer, a personal word that matters to me. In 2011, I had the honor of contributing a chapter on pastors and local churches' expectations of theological education in the former Soviet Union to the Church of the Future. This is a Portuguese language volume edited by Manfred Kohl and Antonio Carlos Barro, in which Moltmann himself was also a contributor. And I mention this not to claim any closeness to him, because I never met him, unfortunately, but for a Ukrainian theological educator like me, ministering near and in the empire that was about to invade my country in 2014, to have one's name appear in the same table of contents as Moltmann's was a small and concrete gesture of inclusion. And also, what is important, an invitation to a wider conversation that Ukrainian theological voices had rarely been invited into at that time. And I want to name that publicly in this centenary year as a debt I have not forgotten. I come from a theological community that also massively serves the people wounded by ongoing Russian aggression, and also from a family in which 5 siblings, cousins, and nephews have been already killed by Russians since 2022, and while another, now 6, are serving on the front line. And the question of the 17-year-old Moltmann who cried in the Hamburg night, "My God, where are you?" is still being asked by my family and by me on the 1520th day of the ongoing Russian war of terror. But here is this analogy I want to name at the outset with all respect to Moltmann. Moltmann wrote after the war. He had 3 years in a Nottingham camp with Psalms of Lament in one hand and the Gospel of Mark in the other, and then decades of peacetime in which to turn that captivity into theology. The bombs had stopped falling. The camps had been liberated. The silence from explosions gave him room to think, and he crafted the theology of hope as the post-war theological reflection, which does not diminish it at all, as it is a scarlet thread I have been looking for since 2014 and since 2022 in my life and ministry when the Russian aggression came into our country. We do not have that post-war silence in Ukraine, and my colleagues and I have been writing and editing the books like Light in the Valley of the Shadow of Death, Beatitudes and Terror, Ukrainian Theological Response to Russian Aggression, and the forthcoming Pastoral Ministry During Wartime, the Ukrainian Experience. And all of them are attempts of a theology produced under missile fire, not after it. When freedom is near, the chains begin to chafe, as Moltmann said. It is not about us, just a philosophical theological formulation. It is the nightly condition of our sleep. And on this centenary, I come not as a student to a professor. I come as a fellow who read his letters from an earlier captivity and discovered they were written in a language I did not know was mine until the Russian war of terror taught it to me. So I want to briefly share 3 things today with one closing image. The first one, in defense of the millennium. It has become fashionable in the wide corridors, and I refer to the Matrix movie, of academic theology to be quietly embarrassed by Moltmann's millennium. His doctrine of a 1,000-year reign of Christ on this earth, a period before the final resurrection in which the poor enjoy freedom on earth and the martyred enjoy fullness of life on earth, is treated as a curiosity, as if the old man in his last systematic book permitted himself one eccentric indulgence, a word on the face of a great theologian and a patch over conceptual theme. But from Ukraine, I would respectfully disagree. Moltmann's millennium is not a conceptual embarrassment. It is one of the most morally serious moves in 20th century theology. And it is the move for which Ukrainian theology has been waiting without knowing that it was waiting. And let me tell you why. For almost 5 years now, we have been told gently or forcibly, pastorally, ecumenically, sometimes even with tears of compassion, that our longing for justice is theologically immature, that we should move toward forgiveness and reconciliation as soon as possible, toward the cheap peace that is, in practice, the quiet erasure of the crime. The justice, if we must speak of it at all, happens only in eternity, where all things are made new, every tear is wiped away, and the victim and the perpetrator stand together before the throne, kissing each other. Some irony here. On earth, meanwhile, we are asked to be silent, to be kind, to stay above the situation, to consider both perspectives, to be, in effect, non-Ukrainian, while encouraging Russians to remain and be Russians. I have been writing against this council for almost 5 years. I will not rehearse the arguments here. I will simply say, Moltmann's millennium cuts through it like a blade. Because what Moltmann insists, and this is the part his critics miss, I think, is that justice must be done on the same earth where the injustice happened. Justice must be done on the same earth where the injustice happened. Not in a timeless, simultaneous, abstract eternity, not on a new earth that has no continuity with the one soaked in the blood of its victims. On this earth, the earth on which Babin Yar lies in Kiev, and Bucha and Izium, and the mass graves of Olenivka, and the tortured bodies in Mariupol, and so on. Moltmann understood this. The man who spent 3 years in a prisoner camp, who watched his country wake up to the photographs of Auschwitz and the ashes of Hiroshima, understood that a purely vertical eschatology, one that leaps from present suffering straight to eternal bliss, dishonors the dead by making their earthly losses unimportant. And it is the eschatology of those who have not buried anyone recently, probably. The millennium is the refusal of premature spiritualization. It is the stubborn biblical insistence that God's justice is not only eschatological, but historical, that the poor are fed not only in the kingdom to come, but in the kingdom that is coming here and now, that prisoners walk free not only on the day of the Lord, but today, tomorrow, the week after the ceasefire. It is why Moltmann can still write, figuratively speaking, after a lifetime of eschatological reflection, that Christianity from first to last is hope, and why an eschatology that abandons the millennial dimension is an eschatology that withdraws from history. And eschatology that withdraws from history is exactly what Ukraine cannot afford, and exactly what some of our Western partners, and no, not all of them, and we know and speak about the difference. So that some of those Western partners, with great love, with great goodwill, with a great deal of let us reconcile right now, are often offering us, referring to the victims, but not to those who support Russian aggression. And I want to be honest also, there are aspects of Moltmann's millennium that I cannot accept as they stand. And his tendency to render eternity as a kind of simultaneous now, like all times coexisting without development, growth, or without story, places an unnecessary burden on the millennium. But this is for theologians to discuss in further theological debates. From Ukraine, such understanding of the millennium is a gift. It is permission for me to say not yet, to say that we believe there should be and will be an on earth reckoning. To say the bodies in the ground will rise on the same ground where they fell, and the cry, how long, O Lord, will have an answer that includes a date, a place, an hour, and a grave. The second idea, the second reflection is on political monotheism and the Ruski Mir, or Russian world ideology. A few minutes ago, we also heard Moltmann's reflections on Moltmann's idea of political monotheism, traced with the clarity and care of a systematic theologian, showing a European audience why God is not a sole ruler. I'm grateful for that framing, and from Ukraine I would add only this. For us, that sentence, that God is not a sole ruler, has stopped being a thesis and has become a tool. A theological resource we reach for when the bishops and pastors across the border, in Russia, are still blessing the missiles and Russian imperialism, blaming Ukrainians for being Ukrainians. The argument Moltmann develops most fully in The Trinity and the Kingdom of God, written or published in 1980, runs like this: that much of Western Christianity and also Eastern Christianity in its imperial forms has functioned practically as monotheism rather than as Trinitarianism. The Creed says Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, but the working picture of God in church and in society has often been of a single divine sovereign, one absolute ruler and one heavenly throne. Unilateral authority over a subjugated creation, God as sole ruler, God as the great monarch. In post-Nazi Germany, Moltmann was diagnosing how Christian, in parentheses, Europe, had tolerated and in places actively supported the absolute state. In Ukraine, the same diagnosis names the theological architecture of the Russian world ideology with uncomfortable precision. One God on one throne of the Russian world, one Russian patriarch, one Russian emperor, one Russian canonical territory, one Russian sacred people. When Moltmann said the Trinity is not a sole ruler, he was not making a scholastic observation about the inner life of God. He was denying the theological premise on which Moscow's empire still rests and still shells and still blesses the shelling. The Russian theology we are resisting, and not metaphorically, but in our streets and in our graveyards, is not just exotic heresy for us from a forgotten council. It is current political monotheism in its purest contemporary form. One ruler, one empire, one truth, one church, one canonical territory, one Russian world, one sacred people, but who are permitted to torture other peoples for the sake of a higher spiritual unity. Moltmann gave us the vocabulary to say that the Patriarch of Moscow's symphony of church and state is not orthodox. It's pre-Christian imperial monotheism with a golden meter. He gave us the vocabulary to say that a church which has collapsed into the person of a single autocrat has collapsed into idolatry, regardless of how many icons hang on its walls or how many heartfelt sermons are delivered from the pulpit. And this is a gift from Moltmann. I want to name it publicly in a centenary year. Moltmann did more for Ukrainian ecclesiology than he himself probably knew. The third reflection, the last one, is about the imprecatory prayers. It's the hardest move. The one I owe to Moltmann and where I must also press beyond him. Moltmann, following his own formation, directs us to the Psalms of Lament and to the cry of dereliction in Mark 15. He teaches us that God is with the sufferer, that the crucified God is present on every gallows of our world, that Auschwitz is not the last word because God was in Auschwitz before any theologian ever spoke about it. In his own words, no theology after Auschwitz, if there had been no theology in Auschwitz. This, I believe, is the deepest pastoral line in 20th century theology. And I owe my own theological educational ministry to it. When I sit with a widow in the church and she has nothing to say and I have nothing to say back, or when I listen to a veteran who is afraid of the dark and cannot sleep with the light off either, or when I refuse to rush to solutions and only stay present, when I resist the temptation to turn her grief or his trauma into a sermon illustration, I'm learning to practice a discipline that Moltmann taught the global church, the discipline of not living. But our Psalter has more than laments. It has imprecations. Psalm 137 with its terrible closing line about the children of Babylon. Psalm 109 curses the wicked. Habakkuk demanding, "How long, O Lord?" not as a pious question, but as an accusation. And the martyrs under the altar in Revelation 6 crying out, "How long, O Lord, until you judge and avenge our blood?" Ukrainian evangelical theology in its 5th year of war has had to rediscover these texts. Our seminaries have had to teach our students that the love your enemies of Matthew 5:44 does not abolish the how long of Revelation 6:10. That pastoral presence with the victim does not require pastoral silence before the perpetrator. That the crucified God suffers with the victim, yes, and the risen God also judges the perpetrator. Both are true. You cannot have one without the other, without becoming sentimental. And sentimentality in this war gives permission for people to be killed, raped, tortured. Moltmann gave us the first half. He gave us the God who is hanging on the gallows next to the boy in the camp. For that we are in his debt. But from Ukraine, in this centenary year, let me complete the sentence. The God who hangs on the gallows next to the tortured boy is also the God who will raise the boy and bring the torturer to judgment, not in a distant spiritualized eternity. I want to believe on earth, in the millennium, at a specific place, at a specific hour, in a specific court, on the soil of the specific crime. And to conclude, Moltmann said there would be no theology after Auschwitz, had there been no theology in Auschwitz. Ukrainian evangelical theologians must now say very quietly and very soberly, there will be no honest theology after Ukraine if we do not do the theology in Ukraine here and now, in the trenches, in the basements and subways, in the bomb shelters, in the trauma counseling sessions, in the funeral, in the chaplaincy training programs, in the seminaries that continue to teach and serve while missiles fly overhead, in the pastoral networks that accompany widows and prisoners of war and families of the fallen and missing. If that theology is not done now, if that theology is not done now by us and our voice, on our soil and in our scared bodies, the world and the global church will one day write a theology instead of us and about us that smoothes over the scars, and we will have lost twice. Happy centenary, Professor Moltmann. Thank you for the seeds of theology of hope. We will keep gathering the flowers of hope from the rubble until there is no more rubble. Keep your children away from war. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Taras. Thank you for such a moving presentation, very personal and I think you would agree, dear participants, that we really, during the feast, we started from reflecting on Jürgen Moltmann as the leader for our time, who actually shaped his theology in response to what he was coming through and trying to reflect deeply and theologically. Anatoly focused, kind of zoomed in our vision, our perspective, and we reflected on particular aspects of Jürgen Moltmann's experience and how he was struggling with that. And Taras attempted to bring us one step further, going beyond thoughts of Moltmann himself and how we can actually proceed further. That was really wonderful. Thank you very much, our dear speakers, presenters, Professor Fiddes and Anatoly and Taras. Thank you very much. And now we can start the conversation. We can start the discussion, and we already have a number of very good questions in our chat. But I would like to start with something I think simple. Professor Fiddes mentioned that Theology of Hope was compiled during the time when there were high aspirations of transformations in Europe. And we are living in a situation where it seems that all the hopes are being closed. Instead of hope, we have hopelessness, and everything is disappearing. In what way we can actually reflect on hope during times like that? And this is the question for all three presenters. And if you could just briefly reflect on that, and we'll probably start with Professor Fiddes, please. We cannot hear you, Professor Fiddes. I'm sorry. You're muted.
All right. Can you hear me now? Yeah. Well, Moltmann's point was that by dwelling upon the great images of the new creation, this provides us with an intolerance to conditions in the present. So actually, his book about hope wasn't so much celebrating the signs of hope that he saw around him, but trying to interpret them in a more revolutionary kind of way, that we should always be discontent with the kind of structures we've arrived at. So this element of discontent, of looking for change, but motivated by the hope of the future, by the great images and indeed dreams, he would say, of God's future kingdom and the new creation. I believe this is permanently valid for us, whatever kind of situation we're living in, whether we're living in a situation that seems to be hopeful or which doesn't seem hopeful at all. We can say this element of discontent. That's what Moltmann took up by talking about protest in his book on suffering. The discontent with the present in the Theology of Hope became protest against the present in the book on suffering.
Thank you very much, Professor Fiddes. Anatoly, Taras, do you have something to add, please?
I think that hope is the central theme during the war. And I don't know what to add, but I think we cannot live without hope in those times. We cannot survive. We cannot go through those times without hope. That's my answer, the short one.
Thank you, Anatoly. Taras? No, Taras has nothing. Okay, so thank you very much. So our next question goes to Taras, and it is from Anatoly. So he recalls the event when Miroslav Volf presented on his part of his book of Exclusion and Embrace in 1993. And after the presentation of his lecture, Moltmann asked him, would you accept or embrace Chetnik? So, and this case is mentioned at the beginning of the Exclusion and Embrace book. So the question to Taras, would you be able to embrace the enemy of your family? And for those who do not know, Taras's brother was paramedic in the army, and he was killed by the Russian drone. So that's really a personal dimension. So Taras, what would you say?
I want to thank Anatoly for this question, because this question comes to me sometimes, but mostly from some evangelical peacemakers that really care about the state of my soul and the soul of our church, and try to push us toward forgiveness and reconciliation. I want to share what I usually respond to them, and it has three short parts. The first question to this question is when, and for me it's definitely not now. So while we are being shelled, murdered, tortured, looted, occupied, dehumanized by Russian propaganda, and while the vast majority of Russian bishops and pastors, they either silently bless the war and aggression or publicly bless it. And speaking about when I look at the crucified God, at Christ on the cross, you don't see that Christ comes from the cross down to embrace priests and Roman soldiers and those who were killing him. And we don't see the disciples and the mother who would be running around and giving hugs to Roman soldiers and priests. So we don't see this. And this is the biblical truth that we often miss in such peacemaking approach. The second is how. I would not do this. And I say if, I don't say when. If, because I allow myself to realize that it may not happen in my life. So speaking about how, I wouldn't do this on the stage as some did, forgiving on behalf of Ukrainians, and Ukrainians never asked those people to represent them, to forgive Russians while they are killing us. So I also speaking about how want to mention that I cannot decide. So Andrei had to decide, but Andrei cannot make a decision. I cannot forgive on his behalf. And the last idea is about the conditions. We are mostly pushed to forgive and reconcile by the way of forgetting and then behaving like nothing happened, not on the basis of truth, not on the basis of reality. And this is what we don't see also in the Bible, because even speaking about salvation, forgiveness from God does not come if we don't name what we want to be forgiven. So my prayer is, Jesus prayed, Father, forgive them. I want to say honestly, with a sober mind, that today I'm praying, God, judge them. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Taras, for your courage and your transparency and sincerity. I know this is really difficult, and I really appreciate the way you responded. We have a number of really good questions, and some of them are for you, Professor Fiddes. And the first is from Alexander Negrov. I think he has left because he had to go to the airport. So his question is, to what extent does Jürgen Moltmann understand suffering primarily as externally imposed through violence, injustice, and social forces, rather than as internally generated through personal moral failure or the burden of one's own wrongdoing. How does his theology of resurrection addresses or potentially leave underdeveloped the dimension of inward suffering associated with moral failure, moral injury, and or moral accountability?
Well, thank you to Alexander for that. I think he's right when he says potentially leave undeveloped, actually. I think that is Moltmann's understanding of suffering as externally imposed. This relates to my own slight criticism at the end of my lecture about Moltmann's notion of eternity, which seems quite static. He talks about simultaneity and complete loss of time. You see, if there's some kind of development in eternity, something like time, not necessarily as we know it, but a form of time, of sequence, then there is room for growth and development, and a time precisely for dealing with that inward kind of suffering, moral failure, moral injury, moral accountability, so that there will be a process of development, of growth, of refining of personality, which involve precisely those things. And it means also, I think, that the oppressors of the world, about whom we've heard, will also need to experience that growth of moral development and understanding and dealing with guilt. Not everything will not, as it were, be transformed at a flash. This is part, I think, of the justice of God that our previous speaker was referring to.
Yep. Thank you very much, Professor Fiddes. And we have another question to you from Cyprian George Luca, a Romanian theologian. And he says, thank you, Professor Paul Fiddes, for a most fascinating lecture. How should Nicene Chalcedonian theologians critically engage Jürgen Moltmann's Trinitarian theology, particularly his Theopaschite claim that the crucifixion is an intra-divine event which God, quote, acts and suffers in himself, the crucified God, pages through 204 and 205. And what doctrinal criteria determine whether such claims remain within or exceed the bounds of orthodoxy?
Well, a huge question. Depends what you mean by Nicene Chalcedonian theologians. Do you mean the following of the affirmations of Nicaea or Constantinople, Nicaea and Chalcedon, or the kind of theology that flowed from it? Because I don't think there's anything within Nicaea and Chalcedon itself which forbids the development of the idea of a suffering God. Certainly the theology that was developed from it did. I did again introduce a slight critique of Moltmann when I suggested that his idea of God inflicting suffering on God, God rejecting God, was perhaps not a language we need use. We ought to think of God participating deeply within human estrangement and alienation, which results precisely in that forsakenness and alienation that Christ experienced. That's the kind of rupture within God that I would like to think of. So if we're going to keep within the bounds of orthodoxy, as it were, I would rather think of God's deep participation in the alienation of the universe rather than a rejection of God by God. I think the other another boundary of orthodoxy would be, can we express the way that God will overcome evil in the end? That this disruption within the life of God will not in fact be final, as it were, so that God will destroy God, but rather God will always overcome evil. And I think Moltmann has pointed us in that way himself when he says that the Father, the Son, and the Spirit experienced death, but in different ways. I think, we must keep alive the hope that evil will be overcome. And we can think of a disruption, a disturbance within the life of the Trinity, which is held within the bounds of God's final triumph over evil. I think Moltmann does that very well, actually.
Thank you very much. I hope, Cyprian, you've got your answer. And now we have a question, and probably those of you who are knowledgeable about 20th century Orthodox theology could participate in that. So it's a question from Fadi Abu Dib. Thank you very much for this interesting lecture. Is there a relation between some aspects of Moltmann's thinking and Orthodox theology and religious thinking of figures like Sergius Bulgakov, Solovyov, and Berdyaev? And goes on. My question is motivated by the motives of eschatological thinking and the concept of all unity, nothing is outside God, that is employed by Vladimir Solovyov and lies at the center of his philosophy.
I think there is certainly a strong relation. I mean, that last point you've made is about Sobornost, really, isn't it? The vision of a community of suffering and loving human beings that also includes the whole of creation. I think that's very much, I think Sobornost, though he doesn't use the word as far as I know, maybe wrong about that, is very much at the center of Moltmann's thinking. Also, Berdyaev's, Bulgakov's emphasis that creation itself is an act of sacrifice by God, because it's a self-giving of God in the making of something other. That's absolutely central to Moltmann's thinking. When I described the withdrawal of God, the making of a space for creation, this is part of God's own kenotic self-giving. That's very much at the heart of Bulgakov's thinking. Berdyaev, I'm not so sure about, because Berdyaev was concerned about freedom being somehow anterior to God, that God's self was subject to some kind of force of freedom. Now, freedom is a very strong motif in Moltmann, but it's always the freedom of God. I mean, here he's much more like Karl Barth. God is the one who loves in freedom. God isn't himself subject to some sort of power of freedom which is greater than God. That was a way for Berdyaev, as it were, of resolving the theodicy question of how there comes to be evil. Well, there's evil because there's freedom. Freedom is somehow prior to God, and therefore God is not liable for responsibility. I don't think we can follow that trend at all, and I don't think Moltmann would have done so. So that's a brief response, looking at those three figures. Solovyev, yes, the idea of Sobornost. Bulgakov, yes, the idea of the sacrifice of God in creation. Berdyaev, the emphasis on freedom. All this we can see lines with Moltmann. And indeed, I think in the overlying orthodox concern for theosis, for the divinization of all things, not becoming God, but becoming more like God and increasing in communion with God. That's at the heart of Moltmann's book on eschatology, as I described it.
Thank you, Professor Fiddes. Taras, Anatoly, do you have something to add to that? Comment on Orthodox? Yeah, thank you.
Maybe one comment on Orthodox theologians, because speaking about Solovyov, Berdyaev, and Bulgakov, we have to remember that all of them have twofold theology. The earlier one, which was very much about Russian idea, and the latest one, when they were objecting and criticizing and even sometimes horrified with their earliest writing and ideas. They were kicked out of the Soviet Union and Russia for that, and like Bulgakov was practically cursed by the Russian Orthodox Church. So, and we see the Russian ideology that is pulling the first or the earlier Solovyov, Bulgakov, and Berdyaev, but they absolutely miss how they themselves deconstructed their own theological frameworks. So maybe I would add just this, but it's a long topic too.
Yeah,
Please.
that's very true. Thank you.
Yeah, I also agree that this is a very valid comment. Thank you very much, Taras. Okay, another question from our participant. Forgive me if I read the name incorrectly. Sees Tulp. Question to Professor Fiddes. Moltmann has often been critiqued for being too optimistic and even of believing in utopia. Although I won't go that far, it appears to me that Moltmann's perspective on the progression of history and the transformation of it by Christian action is somehow rooted in a linear conception of history. However, the complexity of reality, especially with all current crises, makes it hard to distinguish a general transformation towards God's future. At most, we can distinguish hopeful transformations in individual lives, how limited and fragmented that may be. Do you agree with this assessment of Moltmann? Could you elaborate on it? Thank you.
Right. Well, thank you. I think Moltmann actually is not concerned with a general transformation towards God's future because of his emphasis on the God who comes. There has to be Advent, a decisive act of God to overturn the direction of history. I think this is quite strong in Moltmann. It's not a gradual growth towards the kingdom of God. There are anticipations of the kingdom in the church, but the kingdom will only come with the advent, with the coming of God. That's the whole point about his book on eschatology. Actually, I'd be a little critical of Moltmann in this because I think we do need to think actually of transformation going on, which is fragmentary. It's a question, I think, of whether we think that the love that is created through that transformation has some effect upon evil in the end, upon God's own activity towards evil. Does our love added to the love of God actually make a difference to a tipping point of transformation? I believe it does, but it is fragmentary, as our questioner rightly points out. About utopia, of course, Moltmann does have this view of a millennium, which looks a little utopian, really. A millennium preceding the final judgment, which actually is rooted in a great deal of more conservative theology, actually. My own question was whether, quite rightly, Moltmann's concern to see vindication for the oppressed and for the suffering and the justice of God cannot be satisfied in eternity rather than in a literal millennium. If eternity does have within it progression, growth, development, adventure, new events, there is room, I think, for the vindication of the oppressed, and indeed for the realization of wrong done by wrongdoers, painful realization, which is nothing less than judgment, a bringing of truth to light. I do resonate with what Taras has to say in that way.
Thank you very much, Professor Fiddes. I think we are coming to a close, and I would like to address one question to Taras before we finish. So we had a question from Petrosinyuk, who says that Moltmann was a German who directly participated in a war of aggression, yet he made a significant contribution to theology. How does Moltmann differ from contemporary Russian Christian theologians, and what made his development in theology possible? And probably if you, Taras, could also connect that to the question or comment probably from David Contarella, if you could read it. So please.
Yeah. Thank you for the questions. As to the question about Russian theologians, so for the last maybe 10 years, I was reading very slowly, like one book in 2 years maybe, of Moltmann. I'm reading his Crucified God the second time, but after 2022, and still reading pages, maybe 2 pages a day or 5 pages a week, because it's very thick in terms of the content book. And I have my own question here. Will there ever be Russian theologians who write what Moltmann wrote, a theology after Bucha, so the way he wrote a theology after Auschwitz? And for me, the response I found for myself is that, honestly speaking, I don't expect this in this generation, because Moltmann could write what he wrote because he had 3 things that contemporary Russian Christianity and in the West majority Russian evangelicals lack. Again, I know the difference and make the difference. I'm not generalizing like 100%, but speaking about the West majority. So 3 things which they lack: a defeated army, a denazified state, and a church that survived the confessing church. We don't see the confessing church in Russia. We see maybe some individuals, some voices, but not as the church. And then Russia today has none of this. So, and its army has not been defeated, its state has not repented, its church is not a victim of the regime, and it's the regime's court prophet like Rekhovsky and many others who are serving this regime. So, and without those 3 preconditions, I don't expect any theology after Bucha by a Russian theologian from Moscow or Krasnodar or whatever. Maybe somewhat from among exiled Russians, maybe in 10 years, but not now. So this is my response. And as to the second question from David, I also received it many times, and I had very intense correspondence in 22, 23, especially with many Russian pastors and theological educators, because we had been working there for dozens of years before 2022. And my only question in response is to forgive you for what exactly? Because asking just will you forgive us, it's nothing. And I also add that when I hear from Russian pastors, we are against the war, it means nothing. The war is just one of the tools of dehumanization and occupation and annihilation. And it's about the cause of the war, not about the tool of the war. If you don't condemn Russian imperialism, Russian dehumanizing propaganda that dehumanizes not only Ukraine, but the collective West too, so this is nothing. So to forgive you for what exactly? So this is where I would start the dialogue.
Thank you very much, Taras. Dear participants, would you join me in the round of applause to our wonderful speakers? Really thankful to all of you, to you, Professor Fiddes, for your brilliant presentation, to Anatoly for your attempt to bring down to earth and to our context the thought of Jürgen Moltmann, and to you, Taras, for presenting a perspective one step beyond, or after Moltmann, and
or behind,
behind whatever it is. Thank you very much. I think that was a feast today, and I would dare to say that Jürgen Moltmann would appreciate this event and enjoyed the way we reflected on his theology and his life.